So welcome to our web chat with MN ABE, our last one for this fiscal year, May 11th, Wednesday, May 11th. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. It's great to see you all virtually. Let's start with some introductions. Neil, would you like to kick us off?
Hello, everyone. My name's Neil Allard. I'm the Communications and Record Specialist. I forgot that was my title now. It's changed slightly since Alice left us. Whenever you have a question, you can reach out to me and I will either be able to answer or get it where it needs to go.
Thanks so much, Neil. Julie.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie Dinko. I'm the Transition Specialist at the Minnesota Department of Education.
Thanks, Julie. And my name is Brad Haskamp. I'm the State Adult Education Director here at the Minnesota Department of Education. Astrid.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Astrid Leiden, and I'm the Professional Development Specialist on the team. Good to see you all today.
And Jody.
Thanks, Brad. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you. I'm Jody Versat. I am the Program Quality Specialist on the team.
Wonderful. And that is our current adult education team at the Minnesota Department of Education. We are still down a couple people, but if we go to the next slide, we do have some updates or some news. So we are adding 2 new members in the next couple months to our team. First, our high school equivalency and adult education accountability specialist. That position was posted earlier, and we have been in the middle of the interviewing and selection process for that position. So we hope to have some announcements this month yet about that position. Another position is currently posted. It's our grants, records, and administrative support specialist. This position is a modified version of the position that Alice Smith had. So Alice Smith was our GED record specialist, and that records specialty or specialist role is being split between this position and Neil's position. So that will be half of each of their positions. This grants, records, and administrative support specialist will also be doing some grant coordination support for our team and additional administrative support for our team. And so Neil and this new person will be a great combo and team working together to provide all the administrative support and all of the records work for our team. This position was posted and is due, applications are due May 19th. That is when the posting will close. So please share this posting with others that might be interested. And or if you're thinking about applying, we really welcome to see your application. So please get started as soon as possible on those applications, because it's a government web portal to complete those applications. And it does take some time to fill those out. But we're excited to add 2 new members to our team this year. During the course of today's session, we're going to talk through some updates and announcements, and then we're going to dive into some of the adult education or ABE finance. And then we'll provide an overview of ABE grants and applications, and then talk specifically through the ABE grant application documents and process. So a lot to take on today. Let's kick off with some announcements and updates. First, I'd like to share a little bit about HiSET implementation. Just a reminder that HiSET will tentatively be available in Minnesota starting in August or September 2022. The reason that we can't launch any earlier than that is because of some of the upcoming work that we have. First, PSI is taking over HiSET. HiSET used to be operated by ETS. It's now transitioning over to PSI. And this transition is going to take place over the next several months, starting this summer. And so we can't really start the offering HiSET here in Minnesota till PSI takes over the test. And then also, we need to then revise our credentialing database to make sure that we can accept HiSET data and produce HiSET-based diplomas. And then PSI and MDE together will need to set expectations on HiSET testing centers. There's a lot of policy decisions and procedures that we're working on. And also MDE, we're working with our communications staff to develop a plan and messages for our key stakeholders, not just adult education and testing centers, but also thinking about employers, K-12, post-secondary, workforce development, and other key stakeholders that where people might be engaging with potential testers. And the most important stakeholder of all are potential testers. So that is all work that's in development, especially, and we'll be working hard on that over the course of this summer and beyond. Let's go into the next slide. We also want to talk about that 2021-22 additional ABE funding, what's called FIN 166. It's also been called Strengthening Adult or ABE Programming. It's been called SFRF and RBAC funding, federal funding. So the current official end date for this funding is June 30th, but we're working with MDE leadership, the governor's office, and the legislature to see if those allowable dates could be extended through at least August. But we do not have official permission yet at this time to extend the funding period. Our government relations team is trying to help us extend this, but we don't have an official answer yet on that. And then I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
Thanks, Brad. This is Julie with a reminder that the regional transitions plans are due tomorrow. I have received several of them already. Thank you for those who have submitted them. And I should mention that with this regional transitions plan, we're trying something new. This is kind of an addendum to the plan where people can submit a proposal to offer an online statewide training courses pilot. So the course must be online and must be offered statewide, and it must end in a credential or college credit. And federal funding will pay for the delivery of the course, but we want each referring ABE program can count the hours or the contact hours for the learners, but they also need to provide support for the learner to help them succeed in the class. So that's something new. We want to keep the momentum going from the online classes, virtual classes that were offered during COVID, and offer a few of these statewide just as a pilot. Next slide, please. And then I want to talk a little bit about new potential collaborative project with Minnesota State, mostly the community or two-year or technical colleges. And it's around the ability to benefit. And you can read on the slide what ability to benefit is. But it changed a few years back in that it requires people or a learner to be enrolled in a career pathway. And adult basic education is familiar with adult career pathways. We're familiar with how WIOA defines an adult career pathway. So we are positioned very well to work with Minnesota State to transition adult learners from adult basic education into Minnesota State career pathways. What ability to benefit does is it allows a learner who does not have a high school diploma yet to enroll in college and receive Pell funding or financial aid. So the idea is that they can be working on their high school diploma and a credential at the same time instead of having to do it sequentially. Minnesota State will be training 5 to 8 college partners this upcoming year. We think full implementation may be a few years off yet, or down the road, I should say, likely a year or two away. But if you are interested in this and you have a good collaborative partnership with the Minnesota State campus, please bring this to their attention and ask them about it. What's in the chat is a link that you can ask the college to submit an interest form. in regards to this project, and then together you can work on implementing this at the local campus. So just this is just an awareness that this is happening. We're going to be offering more kind of professional development and information about this throughout the entire year next year. So just be aware that that is something that's in the works. And then I'll turn it back to Brad.
Yeah, and just as a close, thank you, Julie. As a closing comment about that ability to benefit, I will say that that is a really exciting option, and it's a new option within our system, requiring some collaborative work with our post-secondary partners at Minnesota State. Also, when you click on that interest form, or when the college clicks on that, the original date for that was at the end of April, but that's been extended by the team to make sure that colleges and AB partnerships that exist still have a chance to voice their interest. Thanks for sharing about that, Julie. Yep. Now, as we look forward to the 2022-23 year, we're planning to return to our typical accountability expectations, which means we're anticipating to have a program improvement process during the 2023-2024 year based on consortium level student outcomes for July 2022 to June 2023. So I know that might seem a long ways off talking about 2024, but we just want to know, starting in July, those student outcomes will have some significance again, and we'll end our hiatus. We plan to end our hiatus on program improvements on that process. And remember, the consortia selected for program improvement will be based on low student post-testing rates and/or measurable skill gains, just like they were pre-COVID, and all of those the more details about that can be found on mnabe.org with our policies, specifically the program improvement policy. So connected to program improvement, then, we want to make sure that all of your students have valid NRS pre-tests. Those NRS pre-tests and post-tests are required to show level gains for your students, your ABE consortium, and for the state adult education system. That's the main way most of our students get a measurable skill gain. And remember that those COVID exemptions for NRS testing will all expire as of July 1 of this year. At that point, you will have to either test all continuing students that still have that COVID exemption, or you'll be limited to entering less than 12 hours of attendance for that individual for the year. So we encourage you, please do not wait until July. Students with no NRS test who have AB contact hours during even May and June of this year and then leave will show as no level on the 2023 or next year's table A, which could affect your program, your consortium's funding. If you wait, the student might be gone and you won't be able to test them. So please make sure you're testing all of those students now. And just connected with that, one other thing that we're doing to make sure to help support testing is we are working with Southwest ABE, our state test trainers, to make sure that there's to purchase more computer-based tests, and those tests will be available to local programs when in the future here. We don't have the quantity yet, and we don't know the process on how we're going to distribute them, but we plan to have a simplified process for distributing those announced in the next couple of months. So stay tuned on that. And at this point, we can go to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Astrid.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brad. So yeah, speaking of testing and administering those tests, we want to make sure that you're all aware of some upcoming opportunities for test training and to get technical assistance around testing. Our testing team is going to be holding virtual office hours coming up later this month. So if you do have any direct CASAS or TABE testing questions, you can drop in and ask them via the virtual office hours. There also will be a number of implementation trainings and recertification trainings coming up. These will all be offered virtually. Implementation trainings are designed for those who are relatively new to testing and is required for anyone conducting testing. And then just a reminder that anyone conducting testing does need to go through recertification at least every 5 years. So the recertification trainings are a way to keep up on that requirement and learn a little bit more about what's new and updated with the various tests. Let's go to the next slide. We also want to let the group know that our Support Professional Advisory Resource Committee, otherwise known as SPARC, is looking for new members, looking to expand membership to all parts of the state. This is an excellent group of support professionals that represent ABE programs in Minnesota. They meet virtually once a month to plan the annual Support Services Conference. They advise our team and the SID staff on policy issues. And it's also just a great place for support professionals to give and receive peer support around a variety of common support services issues. So if you or one of your colleagues is interested to get more involved on a statewide level and would like to learn more about joining SPARC, you can contact Marty Olson. And we do have a number of SPARC members with us today. And if you want to introduce yourselves via the chat, let people know who you are and what programs you represent. We are so grateful to the SPARC team for their role in professional development and helping us to make sure that our policy and guidance is grounded in best practice. So thank you all. Let's go to the next slide. A couple of notes regarding your volunteer data and tracking that. We do have an update to our volunteer training standards policy. As of July 1st, any volunteer training that is required by that policy must be documented in SID. So those training options are currently in SID. If you need any assistance in determining how to track that, you can contact the SID staff for support. And then we want to make sure that everyone is aware of an upcoming webinar that will provide guidance on completing your annual volunteer report that will be due with your August data submission. That will be a virtual webinar on Thursday, June 2nd, and Neil's put the registration information in the chat. Go to the next slide. A couple of professional development announcements. We are going to be running a CCRS implementation cohort in 2022-23. We took a year off last year, so we'll be doing it again this coming year. This is a program-based cohort opportunity to learn how to align resources, lesson plans, and observations to the college and career readiness standards for adult education. You submit a program application, and we ask that there be at least one administrator, one ELA teacher, and one math teacher, ideally. For very small programs, we can make exceptions. So just contact Christine Kelly to talk that through. It will be a hybrid cohort with some in-person and some virtual components and support for travel costs and stipends. So that application is currently available on the Atlas website. It's in the chat. And really encourage, if your program has not yet been through the cohort, we strongly encourage that you do that. Or if you've had a lot of new staff join or turnover, a great opportunity to sort of kickstart your standards work again in your program. Also want to make sure that people are aware that we are going to be running a small pilot of the NGen distance learning platform. This is a platform that is focused on English language learners and specifically a lot of career focused content. We're going to be using some supplemental service funds to purchase a number of NGen seats and then providing these seats at no cost to Minnesota adult education programs. So we'll be offering a pilot information session coming up on May 23rd. If you'd like to learn more about NGen or how to get involved in this pilot, encourage you to participate in that session. Summer Institute is around the corner. It will be offered virtually again this year, and the call for proposals are due in just a few weeks, June 1st. So encourage you and your staff to think about the exciting, innovative work you've been doing over the past few years and put in your proposal to share with your colleagues. look forward to seeing everyone virtually on August 17th and 18th. And then finally, we want to give you a heads up about a variety of professional development that's going to be offered next year. The FY23 PD dates document will be linked in the chat. This is a document that our support network will be updating throughout the year with dates for professional development activities. So you can see here on the slide a number of things already scheduled. Math Institute planning on September 23rd, a virtual event. We are hoping beyond hope that we can hold fall regionals in person this year. So planning on September 30th in Mankato and October 13th and 14th in Walker. Our fall manager meeting, which we're hoping to have in person on November 10th. Support Services Conference, November 17th and 18th, and then the Language and Literacy Institute on January 26th and 27th. And more activities will be added over the course of the year, so mark your calendars. And at this point, I will turn things over to Jody.
Right, thank you, Astrid. I do think maybe we should pause here for a second. We are transitioning into finance information at this point, but I wonder if there are any questions about anything from those announcements and updates that folks want to ask at this point. I did see there was a question and an answer in the chat about program improvement and clarifying the years on that. I wonder, Brad, actually, would you be willing to explain that out loud so it makes it onto the recording?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was asked, so just to confirm that the July 2021 to June 2022 test results from a consortium, those will not be subject to program improvement for the 22 year and starting in fall 2022. And that is correct. We will not be we will not be conducting a program improvement process this fall based on results, test results from consortia from July 2021 to June of 2022. However, I don't want to trying to be very clear that it doesn't mean that test results and measurable skill gains are not significant for us as a statewide system. So even though at the consortium level, you wouldn't have like the consequence of program improvement, we at the state level are still held accountable to our measurable skill gain and our WIOA targets that are set by the federal government specifically for our state. So we as a state system are still trying to meet our targets for our indicators, which include measurable skill gains, which includes test results. Jody, does that seem clear? Do you want me to clarify any aspect of that, or do you want to add to anything about that?
No, I think that sounds right, Brad. Thank you for clarifying that. I think, yep, the message we want everybody to hear is that we understand that testing has been a whole different, ball game because of the pandemic and related restrictions, but we need to ramp back up to regular testing levels and sort of reset the expectations for those level gains. Are there other questions in the chat at this point that we should address before I launch into more info about finance?
Jody, there are a couple that I'll just briefly speak to. Sue asked if there will be a virtual option for fall regionals. Our current plan is to hold the fall regionals in person and then spring regional virtually, trying to balance the different preferences and needs that have been expressed in evaluation. So we're hoping that that balance of activities will meet everyone's needs, particularly since Summer Institute will be virtual again this year. We know that many people are eager to gather in person. So if it is safe to do so, that is the plan. And then Russ asked about the total number of NGen seats that will be available through the pilot. We're looking at probably 160 seats, so not a lot of seats. And most likely looking at an average of about 10 to 20 seats per program. But come to the webinar to learn more, or you can contact the distance learning team at their support email if you're not able to join the webinar.
And we also had one more question about an update on the Minnesota Department of Education if we will be at the location, the new location, and when. I don't know if that's been determined yet. So if Brad knows and he wants to chime in, please go ahead.
Yeah, so we do have a new MDE building that's in Northeast Minneapolis. Currently, though, it's being renovated. It was kind of a big open warehouse space. So they need to build walls and put in cubicles and put in flooring, things like that. So that space is currently being remodeled so that we can actually work out of that space. And the tech needs to be inputted, brought in and everything. We do not know when that building will be open to us to work out of regularly. Like right now, there's a limited number of staff that can go in. And Neil is even going in there every, like maybe once a week just to do some urgent things that need to be done out of the building. But other than that, we're not able to access the building. And we do not yet have a date when the building will be accessible for us to work out of. So in the meantime, we are just required to work out of the house.
All right, I think that we took care of all of the questions in the chat. So I am going to keep going. This is Jody. So this is the time of year when we like to review some of the nuts and bolts of finance information about ABE and adult education. So I'm going to kind of start at the beginning of that. Once I can advance my slide, there we go. So when we talk about ABE funding, generally speaking, there are two pots of funding that your programs receive, most of your programs year after year. One is state funding and one is federal funding. And so the annual application that's due on June 1st, which is coming up, we'll talk a lot more about that. That application is for state funding and federal funding. And for state funding, you might hear about FIN code 322 and federal funding FIN code 438. If you are saying to yourself, what is a FIN code? That is okay. Just so you know, those are codes that are used in the UFARS system, which is a requirement that all school districts have to use UFARS to track and report spending to the Department of Education. We do recognize that some of you out there are working in programs that are not associated with school districts, but because all of this funding flows out to you all through the Department of Education, it is a requirement that all adult basic education programs use UFARS codes to report the different categories of spending. So some of you I know are very, very familiar with UFARS. For some of you, I know it's a little bit more of a mystery sometimes, and that's okay. So also, we just want to sort of give you some reminders or sort of set some baseline expectations at this point in the year as we're looking ahead to a new fiscal year about the funds that we receive and what they are intended to do. So just to be real clear, ABE funding, both state and federal funding, can only be used to provide adult basic education services for eligible adults in your communities. Those funds cannot be used for anything that is under the umbrella of K-12. They also cannot be used for anything that's sort of general community ed, but not specifically ABE. Like they can't be used to offer like, you know, a community ed ceramics class or something like that, right? And another thing just to keep in mind about ABE funds is technically they are reimbursement for the cost of operating an adult education program. So what that means is if there are any funds that are not used for a particular fiscal year, that they can't just be saved up. So a district cannot put ABE funds in a fund balance at the end of the year if they are unspent. They either need to be spent or they are lost. They can't be saved. So that's just an important thing. In case you ever get that question from your business office, it is important to be clear about that. A couple of more reminders. There are some restrictions on how much ABE funding can be spent specifically on administrative expenses. And those caps on admin expenses are 5% for both state funding and 5% for federal funding. And just to note, when we talk about those caps, the 5% cap applies to the award that is granted to the entire consortium. We know that some of you have consortia with kind of complicated structures and a number of different providers, and that funds are flowing from one fiscal agent entity out to maybe to multiple districts or to multiple other providers. But just keep in mind that 5% cap on both the state funding and federal funding applies to the whole thing, right? Not to each individual award to providers. So in terms of UFARS codes, again, this is something you might need to be working through with your business office, particularly maybe this time of year or in the fall when you're doing the fiscal completion report. The way on our end, the way we monitor for compliance to that 5% cap is by looking at UFARS codes. Object codes are used to specify different kinds of expenditures. And so object code 110 and 120 are both used for salary expenses. With your adult basic education funding, you should be careful whose salary is coded to 110 and whose salary is coded to 120. We are checking on our end that object code 110 to make sure that no more than 5% of state and federal funding goes to that object code. We are making the assumption that someone who is an administrator who does not directly oversee day-to-day programming would be coded 110. So that could be the community ed director in your district, if that is maybe your supervisor you report to. It could be the executive director if your ABE program is a CBO. But I think for most of you who are listening in today, you would be more in the role of an ABE manager, and that means you are a person who is directly overseeing the day-to-day operations of programming, including being the direct supervisor or the direct manager for instructional staff and other, support staff and other program staff. In that case, there is no cap on the salary for that particular person because we recognize that you as ABE managers are a crucial, important part of running an ABE program. So your salary should be coded to object code 120 if you are a manager type. So every year some years we have some trouble that folks in the business office end up coding the salary for the manager to 110 when really it should be 120. So keep this in mind if somebody, if an accountant from your program needs some guidance, hopefully that can help. So at this point, we are coming up to the end of a fiscal year. June 30th is the end of the fiscal year. So we want to just give you some tips and reminders to be keeping in mind at this point in the year. So when we think about federal funding, a couple of things to keep in mind. Your federal funds, your federal ABE award for this current fiscal year must be spent out by June 30th. Now, you do have a little longer than that to actually draw down the funds out of CRs. Remember, this is reimbursement, so you incur those expenses and then you go into CRs for the federal funding. You go into CRs, or someone in your business office goes into CRs and actually draws down that funding. You have until October 1st to do that. So you need to spend it all by June 30th. And then you have a couple more months in which you can, draw it down if you need to. But please be sure to do that in the months of July, August, and September. If it gets after October, nobody's happy about that. Your accountants aren't going to be happy, and our grant staff at MDE isn't going to be happy. So please remember, draw down those funds. We know also for many of you, your federal award is so small, it can be easy to forget about it. But please just make a note to yourself to check in with your business office staff about that. So here's a quick question for you about federal funds, and type into the chat anybody who has an idea. What if you get to the end of the fiscal year, June 30th, and not all of your federal funds are spent? Say you got an award for 10,000, but you only spent 8,000. What happens to those 2,000 you didn't spend? Use it or lose it. Thank you, everybody. Okay. Yep, I'm seeing some different guesses. Oops, sorry. This is the correct answer. Actually, no, that money does not go back to the feds. I think the feds, once they get money out of their hands, they don't want it back. I don't know, at least in our case, they don't. What does happen is that those unspent funds actually roll over into the total pot of federal ABE funding for the following fiscal year. So they don't stay with your program. So if you had $2,000 that you didn't spend, it goes back into the total pot, which is several million that gets awarded out the following year. So essentially your leftover $2,000 gets spread out the next year between all of the 30 some grantees, but it's not lost to our system entirely. Of course, you'd rather spend it at your program, I believe, rather than spread it out across the state, but it is interesting to know. Yeah, exactly, Tracy. At least we're not giving it, back to the president, right? Back to the federal government. All right, good. Thank you for participating on that. So then a couple of reminders as it comes to the end of the fiscal year, specifically about state funding, which in some ways is a little bit different than federal funding. So the important thing to remember, or one important thing to remember about state funding, is you actually have a little bit more flexibility in terms of spending it. So with your federal funds, if you haven't spent them by June 30th, that's it. That's the end. You can't spend them, and then they get rolled back into the next year's pot. With your state funds, there's this interesting workaround in state statute that says, if you didn't spend up all your funds by July 30th, you can spend up to 20%, not the whole award. You can't save the whole award to do this way, but up to 20%. You could spend in what we call quarter 5, which is July, August, and September of the following fiscal year. So I know some of you take advantage of this, which is really good. Like, think of this as a sort of as a way to strategically address the fact that maybe when you budgeted for this current year, you budgeted for some expense, maybe some class or maybe some position that you didn't end up incurring that expense. So you ended up spending less than you thought. This is a way to be able to use that up at the end of the year. We would encourage you to think of it as special one-time funding. Do something like this person in the corner here is thinking about, should we get Chromebooks? Should we invest in some new distance learning software? Can we hire a teacher over the summer to do a curriculum project? So please be thinking strategically about this. However, the one thing that's really important when you do this is that you have to course code according to those UFARS codes. Remember, I'm mentioning UFARS codes. You have to course code those funds correctly. So you have to use the right UFARS code. And the code, if you're going to do that this year, if you're going to do fiscal year 22 funds, which technically the award ends on June 30th, but you're going to spend up the last maybe 10% in July, August, and September of this year, then make sure your business office knows to course code those expenses with 002. That's really important because we check for that when we do the reconciliation at the end of the year. Patrick, good question. Does this apply to the special 166 funds from this year? No, it does not. Those 166 funds are federal funds. They are not specifically adult education funds. They were sort of this pot of extra money that came to our state, and the governor kind of divvied it out, and we in adult ed got a little bit. It's very different than all of the rest of that funding, all of the rest of our adult education funding. And so currently, yep, as Karen is saying, thank you. Currently, we know that you have that money to spend through June 30th. We're a little bit hopeful there might be a couple month extension on that, but so far no official word on that. So at this point, do your very best if you can to spend those funds, those 166 funds by June 30th. All right, and just a note about carryover codes. Those codes do change every year. Again, this is something that every year I know is tricky for folks. And if you have a new accountant, new business office staff, they might be a little puzzled by this. I think this mechanism that we have for state ABE funding to carry it over into the 5th quarter is quite unusual, I think, in terms of education funding. So your business office, your accountant might be puzzled. They might need your help. So these are the codes. Again, the one you will use if you're going to do it this year is 002. And then quick quiz, quick question for you. So now we're talking about state funding. So what happens if you have state funds, you can't spend them by June 30th, you can't spend them in the additional quarter, so you get all the way to September 30th, you have not spent all your state funds, maybe your award was 50,000 and you only spent 45,000. In this case, what happens to those 5,000 that were not spent? What do you think? Send it back. Bury it in a hole. Yeah, great idea, Scott. Yes. Thank you. Sue got it right. So with our state ABE funding, if we do not spend it, if we do not use it for adult education programming, it goes back to the state. So we don't send back the federal money, interestingly enough, but we do send back the state money back to the state general fund. And it's no longer available to our ABE system. So just a tidbit for you to know. Yeah, it is a use it or lose it kind of a scenario for our state funding, yes. So we want to encourage you at this time of year, here are some questions that you can ask your accountant or your business office. Presumably, you know, those of you who are managers were asked to do a budget for this year at some point, and now is the point to be checking, are you spending everything that was budgeted for? And at this point, how much is left of your state and federal funds? And are you on track to make sure that all of that gets spent by June 30th? And if it does look like you're going to have state funds left on June 30th, then you can be thinking strategically about what you can use them for in that 5th quarter in the months of July, August, and September. So I know this is a lot and there's a lot of complications, and I know some of you have some unique kind of situations in terms of accounting and business office staff and district leadership and things. You know, so you probably have other questions. We encourage you to talk to each other. I mean, we have on the call today a number of very experienced ABE managers who have done this for many years. So I encourage you to connect with each other and consider each other resources. Your accountant is real smart and, you know, can help you with the sort of accounting practices and procedures. You can check out the grants page on the MDE website. And for now, you can sort of direct those questions to me, and I will do my best to figure out answers or, you know, pass you on to someone else who can help. So I'm going to pause for just a second. That's kind of the end of our reminders specific about finance stuff. Any lingering questions or concerns about any of that before I keep going? All right. I don't see anything. Thank you to those of you who've been participating in the chat. It's helpful to know that you're out there. At this point, we want to give you a kind of an overview reminder for many of you, just sort of the lay of the land in terms of what are our grants, where does our funding come from, what are the applications, and what are the timelines and processes for those different things. So this chart shows you probably the most important key applications for ABE funding that you want to have on your radar. The first line is the annual application, and we will we'll get to that soon. That one is every year, always on June 1st. So that one is the most frequent of these. The Federal Adult Education Competition and the IELCE competition are sort of currently in process. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. Those are multiple years. The 5-year narrative is also multiple years, and it varies. We sort of have a cohort of programs that are required to do that every year. I'll talk more about that in a second. And then there are some other grants out there. I know many ABE programs are involved in a Pathways to Prosperity grant, sometimes like United Way grants. This year we had that special, that FIN 166 funding, the additional ABE funding that was about 10 million for our system. That was a one-time thing. So there are definitely some other things occasionally, but the first 4 lines on this chart are kind of the repeating things that you need to be aware of. So at this point, I'm going to hand it back to Brad to give us an update about where we're at on the federal adult education competition.
Thanks, Jody. So with the federal adult education grant competitions, we have received and screened the applications and the provider worksheets. We then had the reviewers met last week, Thursday and Friday, to discuss the recommendations and their official reviews. Then we also simultaneously, though, have our workforce development boards that are currently reviewing the applications. So all of that is kind of our current, what has currently happened. And if we go to the next slide, we can show the larger time frame here, that larger timeline. So remember that your applications are due March 25th. And then we, MDE, the grants team needed about a week and a half to screen the applications. And then we had a day to screen and send the applications for our adult education team. Then from April 6th to May, reviewers, local workforce development boards, the governor's workforce development boards, and the Minnesota Department of Education have been reviewing applications. We already talked about those virtual review sessions, May 5th and 6th. And then ultimately, we hope to have all of the feedback from the governor's workforce development boards and from the local workforce development boards on the applications. And once we get those in early June, then we'll be able to make our funding recommendations or funding decisions at that point during the month of June. So we'll be reaching out back to all of you that applied in June about your federal adult education grant competition. And we'll have if there's any follow-up that's needed, we'll be reaching out and providing that feedback in the email that we send directly to the fiscal agent. Please note that the emails will be going to the fiscal agent contact, or that primary program contact, not to a bunch of people within the consortium. So that individual will hopefully then, it'll be their obligation to share that with others in the consortium as needed. I see in the chat here, we have a question. What are the implications of workforce development board feedback? Anything except checking a box. So the workforce development board feedback, we are required to consider that as we make funding decisions. The key questions that the workforce development boards are looking at is they look at your collaboration section of the document, specifically where each grantee is required to respond to. How are you working with workforce development partners? How are you meeting the local and regional needs according to the workforce development partners and plans? So they determine alignment. Do they see alignment between what the ABE consortium or the adult education consortium is proposing and what the local WIOA plan says and what those local needs are? What are the occupations in demand? Is there a match there? Or is there a mismatch? What strengths do they see in the applications? What questions or recommendations do they have in the applications? So those are all helpful feedback for us as we think about making decisions. Now, granted, and that feedback will also be provided to each grantee, the feedback from the workforce development boards. Now, granted, they don't have any official scoring power. That's really those virtual review sessions that were led by Minnesota Department of Education staff. That's the official evaluation form. But these workforce development board forms are reviews are also extremely important in providing helpful feedback for consortia to consider moving forward and for us to consider as we think about our system. I hope that's clear.
Yes, I think it is. Thank you, Brad. And then Julie, will you give us some updates on where we're at with the IELCE competition?
Sure. Thanks, Jody. This is currently in process. The grants were due at the beginning of March and went out to reviewers, and we had enough reviewers who scored them, sent them back in. So that has been tallied, and currently it's back in the hands of the grants team here at the Minnesota Department of Education for their review of the scores. We're hoping to make an announcement at the end of May. And I'd just like to thank all the individuals who did review this grant. It's very much appreciated. And I think we always have some great people reviewing the grants. So thank you again. Back to you, Jody.
Thank you, Julie. So then I just want to kind of give you an update or confirm where we are at with the 5-year narrative process. So normally every year we have kind of a cohort of consortia that are required to submit a narrative, but this year it's canceled. Or in other words, this year no consortia are required to submit narratives on June 1st of this year. And that's because of the federal adult education competition. So we know that most all of you spent a lot of time and effort this year working on that particular application for the federal adult education competition. So we did not run a 5-year narrative process this year. However, we will be starting up again with another group of consortia that are required to submit 5-year narratives in 2023. So this is the list of 6 consortia that are sort of on deck for next year. So those of you who work in these consortia and these programs, no need to panic at this point, but definitely a good idea to be thinking ahead to the upcoming year and just knowing that the 5-year narrative is a time-consuming task. And so you will want to be planning and budgeting for that as you think about your activities for the upcoming year. I see Anessia is excited about that. Yep. So for those of you in that group, please do mark this date on your calendar, November 2nd of this year, 2022. We will plan to have a narrative writers workshop for that group of 6 consortia that are required to submit in 2023. And that is the point at which you will get all of the detailed requirements for the 5-year narrative. And you'll get the opportunity to ask questions and discuss with your team members and sort of launch into the process of writing the narrative. And then that narrative will be due on June 1st. And just a reminder for those of you or update for those of you kind of newer to the system, the way that we run the 5-year narrative is that we always ask the writers from the subsequent year to review their previous year narratives. So if you're in the cohort for 2024, then you'll get a chance to review these in 2023. But we will continue to remind you all about those timelines as we go. All right, so again, I'm going to pause here. Does anybody have any questions specific to any of these grant applications, timelines, 5-year narrative, federal competition? I'm not seeing anything. So I think I will keep going, and sort of our last big piece of content that we have for you today is information specifically about the annual ABE grant application for this year. So the grant application materials are now posted on the MDE website. I know there are some of you out there who realized they ideally would have been posted earlier than this week. And some years they have been posted, mid-April, and that's what we were hoping for. But there's a lot happening at MDE these days, and the grant staff is understaffed, and there's been some turnover, and so things got a little behind, but those grant materials are now posted on the MDE website. And there are 3 documents that are posted there. There's an application document, there's an instructions document, and there is a tables document. And the due date for the application and the tables is June 1st, as it always is. This year, June 1st falls on a Wednesday. And for the last several years, we have added the 3:30 p.m. on the June 1st to prevent you from working on it at 11:30 p.m. when it used to be that the deadline sort of defaulted to midnight. So June 1st, 3:30 p.m. is when that application needs to be submitted in SERVs. And just a point of clarification too, before I keep going. As many of you know, this year we ran the federal adult education competition. We run the 5-year narrative cycle. Both of those processes are processes where you all have to show that your consortium, your programs are offering high quality programming and meeting minimum standards and things like that. Those are detailed. There's a lot of time and effort and work put into those. And the result of those two competitions, the result of the federal competition, is essentially authorization to continue receiving federal adult education funding every year. The result of the 5-year narrative process is when your 5-year narrative is approved, that is authorization to continue receiving state ABE funding every year. Once your program has that authorization, then annually you submit this application, which is less onerous. It's not a narrative. You don't have to spend paragraphs describing programming, right? But you just have to submit basic information about your program and the fiscal agent and your tables with data. And so this application is what then allows you to receive annually a federal award and a state award. So I just want to kind of set that background of how this application fits into the bigger set of grant processes that we run. So just a reminder, this has been the case for a couple of years, so hopefully this shouldn't trip you up, but just to remember, it used to be that the application documents were sort of just publicly available on the MDE website, and that is no longer true. You will have to have someone who has CRS access and has worked through the process to create their own EDM account, which is sort of, it's a security measure, right? So just a note that somebody who has that access will have to go in and download these documents. That could be you, it could be somebody in your business office. And so just an outline quickly of the process. So that is the first step, that somebody goes in there and downloads those documents from the MDE website, from the CRS section of the MDE website. There are 2 of the documents that you are going to complete: the application and the tables. The instructions document obviously is just for your reference. You do not need to complete or do anything with it. I do just like to specify, because this does trip up new folks sometimes. Yes, you have to get your data out of SID, and yes, unfortunately, you have to, or somebody has to actually key it in to the Microsoft Excel tables document. It would be great if the data system SID would talk directly to our data system here at MDE that runs the funding calculation for us, but that is not the case. So we need you to get your data out of SID, put it into our spreadsheet, and submit it to MDE so that it can be entered into our software system on our end. It's unfortunate that that feels a little bit duplicative, but it is the process that we need you to do. So once you have your application filled out and your tables filled out, then those 2 documents get uploaded back into CRS. And this is a very important step that also sometimes trips people up every year. Your authorized signer needs to log into CRS and virtually sign by the June 1st deadline. That is usually your superintendent if you are in a school district, or your executive director if you are in a CBO. Be sure to plan ahead. It seems like every year somebody's superintendent is, golfing that first week, or I think we've had circumstances where somebody was in the hospital. So, and obviously we'll work with you in case of emergency. We will absolutely work with you to, to do what we need to do. But please do be planning ahead, and please be sure you know who that person is and that this deadline is on their radar, because it is a small step. But it is an essential important one. Your application cannot be processed without that signature from that authorized signer. So Susan is asking an excellent question. Can we use the documents that Neil linked, or do we need to download them from CRS? download them from SERVs. I'm not 100% certain that at this point it would cause a major problem if you used the ones you grabbed from the chat today. But in the past, we have gotten that message from grant staff that they want only the document directly downloaded from SERVs, not shared in any other way. So yes, please be sure you go into SERVs, download the documents, fill in those documents, put them back in SERVs just to prevent any possible problem. And honestly, you need to be able to log into SERVs to finish the process. So you might as well start the process by logging into SERVs and grabbing the documents there. But good question, Susan. All right, so I'm going to take some time to walk you through the grant documents a little bit more specifically, and I want to start with the application document. So the application, honestly, this particular application, as many of you know, because you've done it in years past, it's fairly boilerplate. But the thing that we always recommend to folks, especially this time of year, is please do really be aware of those assurances. It is a good idea to read the assurances once a year. And just note, the assurances are the agreements, right? So you are saying, you're an authorized signer technically, but your program is saying, we accept these funds and we agree to use them in these ways or with these parameters, right? So we just encourage you to, be aware of what you're signing, of what you're agreeing to. I don't think there will be any that will shock you, but it's good to remember what's there. Many of the assurances are very generic and just related to government funding. I think there's one about, don't text and drive. So there's some very, very general ones. But there are also, at the end of the list of assurances, there are some that are specific to ABE. This isn't the exhaustive list, but this is some of them, some of the key ones. I won't read them to you. And again, I don't believe these will surprise you, but just to be clear, these are some of the things that you are agreeing to by signing the application, by submitting the application. Here's a few more. You're agreeing to stay in email communication with our office. You're agreeing to have somebody show up at key ABE events, including this one. Consortium agreement and MOU with your workforce center. So just keep in mind, remember that that those assurances are there in the grant, and it's good to kind of review them this time of year. Nope. Yeah, I guess so. That is all really that you need to know about the application. Tom, I do see your question. Why all the concern about secure downloads? Honestly, I have that question as well. But I think that knowing that MDE is a large state agency, it is a large government machine, and a lot of money moves through MDE, most of it K-12, and we are a very small portion. So we tend not to get a lot of sort of attention, which can be good or bad. But I just think it's best to do our best on our end to complete the processes the way that the grant staff recommends in order to just, prevent any undue heartache. I do think as a government agency, MDE does have to be very concerned with, with safety and security. So we do our best. Any other questions about the application? All right, then let's spend some time talking about the tables. So the tables are where you will enter some different kinds of data about your program. And thank you, Neil, for sticking this spreadsheet document in the chat. Again, that is there in the chat for you to open right now if you'd like to, so that you can be looking at it as I'm talking about it. But as we've already mentioned, please do, for your official grant submission, please do grab that, go into SERVs, download it, and fill out the one that you download there. But this one is here as a reference for you for today, because I recognize you're probably going to want to, be looking at it as I'm talking about it. So the tables document is an Excel document, and it has 5 tabs. One of the things that we noticed about the document this year, as it got posted to the MDE website, is the tabs might be in a different order. So I apologize about that. If that's the case, you can feel free to reorder them. This is the order. The order they are on this slide is the order that I think of them in. It feels like the quote unquote correct order to me, but as long as you have all 5 of the tabs and have entered your information in all 5, it doesn't matter so much what order they're in, but there definitely should be these 5 tabs: Table A, Table A1, Table 7, Table 14, and Table B. So we're going to take some time to walk through each one of these tables and what data you need to put in each one. So Table A is where you report your contact hours and your students for the previous year. Table A is the time period that we sometimes refer to as the contact hour reporting period. So it's the May to April time period. So for this year, for this Table A, you should report students and hours from May 2021 through April 2022. Now, this is different than Table A1. Table A1 looks exactly the same, but it has a different date range. So those of you who've been around a couple of years will remember we added Table A1 in 2020. So this is the 3rd year that you will be submitting Table A1 in addition to Table A. And you will recall the reason we did that was because we were trying to figure out, wow, how are we going to account for the fact that starting in March of 2020, the pandemic totally changed the regular way that we were accruing contact hours. So what we decided to do at that point was to grab this count of pre-COVID contact hours. So from March 29th, the 1-year period from March 14th, 2019 through March 13th, 2020. So that sort of represents the last year's worth of, the old normal, right? I don't even want to call it normal really, but just what life used to be, right? That represents what our programming used to be and the hours and students that were typical for before the pandemic. And we know it's quite different now. So here's what this means for the upcoming fiscal year and how we're going to calculate funding for the upcoming fiscal year. So fiscal year 2023 is the year that starts on July 1st of 2022. So it's the upcoming fiscal or budget year. So as our team goes through the process of dividing up our pot of state funding and our pot of federal funding out to all of the individual grantees, as you know, contact hours is one of the important pieces of the formula. So this year, according to the recommendation that was made by the contact hour working group that was convened last year, and then this recommendation has been approved by the MDE finance staff, we're going to take a look. When you submit your application, we're going to look at your Table A, we're going to look at your Table A1, whichever one has the higher count of contact hours, we will input that into our software and use that in the calculation of funding. Yes, I have exactly that same curiosity, Tom. As far as we have heard, we have not yet heard of any consortium that will have a higher total on this Table A, May 1, 2021 to April 30th, 2022, than they did on Table A1 pre-COVID. But it would be interesting if anybody's in that scenario, we'd be interested to hear. I think we have heard that there are some sites where that might be true, but so far it doesn't seem to be true of any entire consortium. Yeah, some of us wish that were true, right? I know your hours, I think in some cases hours on this year's Table A are a bit larger than last year's Table A, but it doesn't seem like we are back to pre-pandemic levels. So I think what's likely going to happen is that likely we will just use those Table A1 counts again for every consortium, which means that the distribution of funding will look very similar to what it has looked like in the last 2 fiscal years. All right, so I'm going to keep going. I just want an important note is that when you look at your reports in SID, you will not see a Table A1 report. The way that you get that data out of SID is just to run the table A report and change the dates. So for this year, you run it for that May 1st, 2021 to April 30th, 22, and then go in, change the dates. These shows the dates for the table A1. So it's the same report in SID, you just run it for different dates in order to get the data to fill in those two tables. So one note that adds a little bit of complication this year, and partially this was a little bit of an error or an oversight on our end. So my apologies that this is going to make things a little more complicated for you for this year, but hopefully we can, hopefully it will work smoothly. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any troubles or questions. But I just want to note, when you pull your table A for May 2021 to April 2022 hours for this year, there will be a new row on here that indicates COVID test only with hours after September 30th. And that is because we decided that after September 30th of last year of 2021, that you needed to start pre-testing everybody, that we weren't going to allow use of that COVID exemption for new students anymore. But you might have had some students who are still hanging around and still attending who have that COVID exemption and never got it tested. If that's the case, you will have students and hours that show up on your table A report in that COVID test only line. Unfortunately, that line did not get added to the table A, to the Excel document. So here's what we'd like you to do as a workaround for that. When you are filling out this table A, what you should do is combine these COVID test only students and hours together with any no level assigned students and hours, and on your table A spreadsheet, report the combined total in this no level assigned row. So you'll notice in this example, this is pulled from Metro South. So shout out Metro South folks. Jenny, our SID support person, gave this to me. So you'll notice that this 353 is a total of these 34 students plus these 319 students. And this 3,218 hours is a total of these our 1421 hours and 1796. And the important way you can check this and make sure that you've done it right is that your grand totals should still match, right? So we've still got 2,050 students and 135,843 hours on both of these reports. So make sure that you get the totals right, but unfortunately we're missing this COVID test only row on the spreadsheet you need to fill in. So you'll need to lump those two rows together into this no level assigned row on the table, on table A. For table A1, it won't be an issue because you won't have, when you run that report in SID for the table A1 dates, this line won't show. So I hope, can you just chat out a little bit of confirmation to me that that makes sense to you? Hopefully that's not too tricky. Thank you, Tracy. Brian, I'm not sure what you meant. Got it, yes, clear, okay, all right, thank you. Yep, appreciate that. Awesome, thank you so much. Okay, again, feel free to circle back to me when you maybe when you're looking at it next week, you're going to be like, oh yeah, Jody explained that and I understood it then, but now I don't understand it anymore. Like that happens. So feel free to reach out. All right, thanks everybody. Okay, so then just a couple of notes about table A and table A1. This data is really important because it's tied to your funding. So I believe that you feel the importance of this data, but I just want to reiterate that. And again, as I said before, just so you know, these numbers that you turn in on your table A, or probably in most cases your table A1, this is what we are keying into the software on our end. We on our MDE end do not check what is in SID. Sometimes that happens as folks, will come back to me later and say, wait, why did our aid get calculated with X number of contact hours? When I look in SID, I see Y number of contact hours. And I have to say, well, what we use is what you report on your tables. So if somebody mysteriously finds some extra contact hours and quickly enters them, if that happens after you've already, filled out this Excel form and got it ready to submit, then we aren't going to know that on our end. So just be sure everybody understands that. And also remember, you have submitted this table A1. It should be exactly the same data that you submitted in June of 2021 and in June of 2020. So please do make that check. Last year in June of 2021, Jenny and I had a whole list of folks where we compared those two tables and they weren't the same. And for the most part, we were able to figure it out. But we hope that you'll do some of that, on your end before you submit. Look at your table A1. If it does not match what you submitted a year ago, then start asking some questions why. And you might want to reach out to SID support staff if you can't answer those questions. Jenny, I'm pretty sure Jenny's on. Do you want to put in the chat, Jenny, how folks can best contact you if they have those kinds of questions? All right, I am going to keep going. So tables A and A1. Yep, thank you, Jenny. Tables A and A1 are where you report your contact hours and your students, and those are crucial because that has to do with funding. The next table is table 7. This table has to do with staffing. This table and several of the rest of these tables, the reason we are asking you for this information is because we as the state office have to put all of this data together and then report it to the federal Department of Education. So that's why we're asking it of you. Just a note about table 7 is that as of almost 2 years ago now, we are requiring all ABE programs to put their staff and volunteers into SID. So it should be relatively straightforward to run your table 7 from SID. But please eyeball it, right? If you run it from SID and you're like, wait, we don't have that many staff, then you may need to check and possibly add some end dates for old staff and old volunteers that are not around. Oh yeah, thank you, Jenny. Sorry about that. This is an old email on this slide. The correct email Jenny put in the chat, it is sidsupport@literacymn.org. So sorry about that, Jenny. Thank you for pointing that out. So that is table 7. All right, the next table is, this is a bit of a change from last year in the last several years. So in the last several years, we had a table that we called table 13, and we have now replaced that with this table that we are calling table 14. It is similar to table 13, but it is asking you for a little bit more information than what you reported on table 14. And again, the reason we are asking you for this is because this is what the federal Department of Education is asking us as a state to report back to them for our entire statewide totals. So we have to take, these documents that you submit to us, create totals, and then report that back to the federal government. So this is what table 14 looks like. There's sort of a couple of things that you're reporting on table 14. One is that you're reporting the providers in the consortium and what kind of entity that they are. So for every consortium, there is one single fiscal agent entity. For most of you, that is a local education agency or a school district. For some of you, it's a CBO. For one of you, it's a correctional institution. Oh, a couple of you, it's a correctional institution. So there should only be one somewhere in column B, and the total at the bottom of column B can only be 1. It must be 1. It cannot be any number other than 1. Column B should be 1. In column C, if you have additional providers. So a provider, just a reminder, a provider, the way we are using that term is for any entity that uses ABE funding to employ teachers and provide ABE instruction. So if the fiscal agent entity is passing on some either state or federal adult education dollars to another district or to a CBO or to a correctional facility, then those additional sort of downstream providers need to be reported in column C according to what type of entity they are. And then we've got a check on the bottom of this report that says provider total for consortium. That is going to total your total of column B, which should be 1, and your total of column C, which could be anywhere. For many of you, it's 0. For some of you, it's, I'm not sure, and maybe as many as 10 or 12 or something like that. So please check that that total of providers looks correct. The other thing that you're going to report on table 14 is about your funding and how it got distributed out to the different kinds of providers. And what's new this year is we need you to include not just your federal funding and your state funding, but in addition, any IELCE grant money that you get. So if your consortium does not get an IELCE grant, then you don't really need to worry about this part. If the fiscal agent entity or any provider within the consortium gets an IELCE grant, then you need to provide this information. Here, again, you just need to list the number of providers according to the type of a provider, and this will be duplicated. So any number here in column D is going to represent the same entity that you've already reported in column B or column C, and that's okay. This total does not include, the total at the bottom does not total column D here. It's only totaling columns B and C. So then the other thing to know is when you report here your federal funding, which you've always done on table 13, but now you need to include the total of your federal award from your award letter and any IELCE grant money. So that needs to be a total of your regular general federal ABE funding plus your IELCE funds. And then what amount was distributed out to the different kinds of providers. And the same thing for state funding. So a couple of notes about that. As I just said, what you're including here in terms of funds are your state funds and your federal funds. But remember, with federal funds, you now need to include those IELCE funds. Do not include that FIN 166 money we've been talking about, the additional ABE funds, those one-time funds. Those really technically aren't adult education dollars. So do not put them on this report. Remember that, or just a note that column E, as I said, this column has to equal your federal funding plus your IELCE funding. So you can find that from your award letter. And then for your IELCE funds, you should have gotten an official grant nor award notification. That's where sort of the total is. You want to make sure that you're reporting the total that was awarded to you. And for column G, your state funds should match that, your award letter as well. All right, I'm going to keep going. Then the last table that we have in the set of tables is table B. So, okay, I'm going to pause for a second. Chelsea, good question. We want a report of IELCE funds awarded, not spent. That is an excellent question. Brad, do you want to weigh in on that question?
Yep. What we need is actually the funds that were spent, not awarded, because we need to, because if you didn't spend them, you'll be returning them back. They basically will never get distributed out to you, and we'll have to redistribute them the next year. So just put the amount that is actually spent.
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you, Brad. All right, and I'm going to keep going. We're getting close to our time here. We have one more table to talk about. The last table is table B. Table B has not changed. I think we added it 2 or 3 years ago. We adjusted it a little bit this year, but it is the same as it was last year. So just a note about sites. This table B is meant to be looking forward a little bit. So tell us about your plans for sites for this year. And any sites that you are planning to run programming during this current upcoming program year, 22-23, please list them here on the report. Again, just want to reiterate what we're talking about when we say providers is that's everybody that's receiving any funding or that's receiving funding to employ their own teachers and offer instruction. So if they're doing that, they should be listed here under the provider section. Just a couple of notes. Remember what a provider is, and then some of you have, many of you actually have members within your district or within your consortium that are not providers. So they are members of the consortium, but they're not actually receiving any funding, and they should be listed in the second section under members. Please be sure to give us a building name as the site, a complete address, and you need to mark these non-public if they're not public, such as like a correctional facility. So I know we're getting kind of close to the end of our time, and I do see that there's some conversation happening still about table 7. Those are good questions. I'm going to keep going here kind of quickly just to make sure that we get to the end, and then we'll circle back to that. So here's an example of from Detroit Lakes of a correct table B. So this has a bunch of sites and then a bunch of members that are not providers. So they're listed on the second part. Here's another correct example where there are several different providers. This is a sort of a partial, kind of grabbed this from Southeast ABE. It's not their entire report, but partial report from Southeast ABE with several providers and then some additional members that are not providers. This is a mistake people have been making. Please be sure to tell us sort of the building name under programming site. Please be sure to use a complete address, not just the city where it is, not a PO box, that doesn't work. And please be sure to mark non-public sites such as a jail. Final note about table 14 and table B, please check your provider total on the bottom of table 14 should equal the number of providers you have listed on table B. So please check that before you submit. So just to reiterate quickly, what you're going to need to submit by June 1st is your annual application and that tables document, which has it's one Excel document, but it has those 5 different tabs that you will need to fill in. So we are almost at the end of our time. Thank you to everybody. I wonder at this point, I've kind of lost track a little bit of what's happening in the chat. Brad, do you want to?
Yeah, I can clarify. Chelsea had followed up with some additional information, which I think is helpful for me to just reiterate that when I say note what you're actually going to spend, what I didn't say is by the end of the fiscal year, because yes, you are submitting this before the end of the fiscal year. So think of so if you know you're going to be underspent, just predict your underspending. If you're fairly certain you're going to, or if you believe you're going to be spending it all the money allocated by the end of the fiscal year, then just put all of that money. So again, there is a little bit of a prediction there.
Right. Hopefully so I think, I think the clarifying thing is we are not asking you to report what you have spent by June 30th. We are asking you to report what you are going to spend for the entire fiscal year, but we understand you may have to estimate a little bit of what's going to be spent in June. But if you plan to spend the whole thing, even if you haven't spent it all by June 1st, then report about spending the whole thing. Mary Lynn, we did not put the link partially because it's no longer a direct publicly open link. You have to have, somebody has to have access to serves, which means they have to have that EDM account. If you go to education.mn.gov and go to district schools and educators, business and finance and grants, you can navigate to it. But it's not unless you have that EDM account, serves account set up, you won't be able to grab it. So that's why we didn't include the link. Thank you, Brad. Were there any other questions in the chat or was that, did we address all of the questions about that table 7?
I think you got them all.
Great. All right, I wonder at this point, I think, do we want to end the recording? And I'm available to stay on for a little longer, but we are at the end of our time. If folks want to sort of ask questions in a more formal, not recorded way, that would be okay.